The 1960s gave us legendary motorcycles, but not every machine was built for glory. Today, we bring to you the 15 worst motorcycles from the 60s. 15. 1967. Vincent Firefly. By the late 1960s, Vincent was a fading name in the motorcycle world, and the Firefly was a disappointing final act. Designed as a simple clip-on engine for bicycles, this 45 cubic centimeter two-stroke motor was meant to give pedal bikes a little extra push. Instead, it delivered an underwhelming 1.3 horsepower, barely enough to move faster than a brisk jog. Reliability was one of its biggest flaws. The Firefly had a reputation for overheating, seizing up, and stalling without warning. The carburetor was notorious for clogging, and the fuel mixture had to be precisely measured, or the engine would either flood or run too lean. Even when running correctly, the Firefly was painfully slow. It struggled on even the slightest inclines, often requiring riders to pedal like they were on a standard bicycle. Compared to later mopeds, the Firefly is an oddity of history, more of a novelty than a real motorcycle. Coming at number 14, 1961, Triumph Tiger Cub. 14. 1961, Triumph Tiger Cub. The Tiger Cub was Triumph's attempt at an entry-level motorcycle, but instead of a stepping stone, it became a frustrating ownership experience. At first glance, the 199 cubic centimeter four-stroke single had decent specs, 10.5 horsepower, and a top speed of about 65 miles per hour. However, it didn't take long for riders to realize that the little Cub had big problems. The most common complaint was the weak and fragile gearbox. Many owners experienced jumping gears, false neutrals, and sudden transmission failures. Oil leaks were another nightmare, often appearing just weeks after purchase. Triumph's notorious total loss oiling system meant that unless riders kept a close eye on the levels, the engine could run dry and seize up. Starting the bike was also an unpredictable ordeal. The Kickstarter mechanism was known to slip, sometimes violently kicking back at the rider. For a beginner bike, it was more of a headache than a learning tool. 1966, Matchless G15 for number 13. 13. 1966, Matchless G15. Matchless motorcycles were once a respected British brand, but by the mid-1960s, they were in decline. The G15 was their attempt at reviving sales, using Norton's 750cc parallel twin engine in a matchless frame. On paper, it seemed like a smart idea. In reality, it was a mechanical disaster. The G15s had poor handling. The frame was not designed for the weight and power of the Norton engine, leading to serious stability issues. High-speed riding felt wobbly, and cornering was unpredictable. Riders often found themselves wrestling with the bike rather than controlling it. The gearbox was a mix of parts from different manufacturers, leading to inconsistent shifting. Oil leaks were so common that many owners carried extra oil just to make it through a ride. The G15 is a relic of bad engineering choices, proving that throwing a big engine into a mismatched frame isn't always a winning formula. Sliding into number 12, 1963 Velocette Viceroy. 12th, 1963 Velocette Viceroy. Velocette was known for making elegant British motorcycles, but the Viceroy was an awkward misstep. Unlike their classic single-cylinder models, this was a fully enclosed scooter with a horizontally opposed 250cc two-stroke twin. It looked strange, performed worse, and failed to win over riders. The most puzzling design choice was the engine placement. Instead of being beneath the rider, like most scooters, it was positioned at the front, driving the rear wheel through a long shaft. This made the Viceroy incredibly front-heavy, affecting both balance and handling. Despite its 15 horsepower output, the Viceroy was sluggish. It had poor acceleration, an unresponsive throttle, and struggled to keep up with traffic. Production was short-lived, and for good reason. It's just proved that even legendary manufacturers can make serious miscalculations. Think all vintage bikes are classics? Think again. Number 11. 1968. BSA Rocket 3 BSA had high hopes for the Rocket 3, a 750cc triple-cylinder motorcycle designed to compete with Honda's CB750. 58 horsepower, a top speed of around 120 miles per hour, and a unique 3-into-2 exhaust system. But none of that mattered when reliability issues and poor design choices turned it into a frustrating machine. The air-cooled engine ran extremely hot, especially in traffic. Riders often experienced excessive heat on their legs, and the engine's tendency to overheat led to frequent breakdowns. The gearbox didn't help either. The shift pattern was reversed compared to most motorcycles, which confused riders and increased the risk of misshifts. Vibrations from the engine made long rides uncomfortable, and oil leaks were almost guaranteed after a few thousand miles. While some collectors admire its rarity, it's a nightmare to maintain and lacks the dependability needed for regular riding. Hello, Speedster. Take some time to like this video and share with fellow enthusiasts. 10. 1964 DMW Deemster. Designed for police and government use, the DMW Deemster was supposed to be a sturdy, reliable scooter-style motorcycle. Instead, it became infamous for its poor performance and mechanical headaches. At its core was a 250cc two-stroke twin, producing around 16 horsepower. This was barely enough to move its heavy frame, making acceleration sluggish and highway speeds nearly impossible. The Deemster had an awkwardly long wheelbase and small 12-inch wheels, making it feel unstable, especially in corners. The front-end reasons. 9. 1969. Norton Commando Fastback. The Norton Commando was praised in its time for its innovative isolastic frame, designed to reduce vibration. The Fastback model, however, was riddled with problems. The 750cc parallel twin engine produced around 58 horsepower, but while powerful, it was a maintenance nightmare. Oil leaks were an ongoing battle. The engine cases never sealed properly, leading to constant drips that stained garage floors and required frequent top-ups. Electrical gremlins were another issue, with the Lucas ignition system earning its infamous nickname, the Prince of Darkness. Headlights would flicker or cut out completely, and the charging system often failed, leaving riders with dead batteries. Then there was the gearbox. The 4-speed transmission was known for being clunky, with stiff shifts and occasional false neutrals. The clutch also had a reputation for slipping under hard acceleration. The Commando Fastback was more of a challenge than a joy. Number 7. Broke the bank. 1962 Francis-Barnett Fulmar 8. 1962 Francis-Barnett Fulmar. Francis-Barnett was known for making small commuter bikes, but the Fulmar was one of their weakest efforts. The 149 cubic centimeter Villiers two-stroke engine put out a measly 7.5 horsepower, which was barely enough to keep up with traffic, even in the 1960s. Today, it's completely impractical for modern roads. The Fulmar had a pressed steel spine frame, which was meant to be cheap and lightweight, but it resulted in a ride that felt wobbly and unstable. At speeds above 40 miles per hour, the bike had a tendency to weave, forcing riders to constantly correct their line. Build quality was another letdown. Cheap materials meant parts wore out quickly, and the exhaust system rusted easily. The Fulmar was also plagued by electrical problems. The wiring harness was poorly insulated, leading to shorts and failures. The kickstarter mechanism was fragile, sometimes slipping and refusing to engage. Even as a collectible, the Fulmar has little appeal. It's underpowered, poorly built, and a hassle to maintain. Coming up as number 7. 1967 Royal Enfield Interceptor, the motorcycle where hope comes to die. Number 7. 1967 Royal Enfield Interceptor 7. 1967 Royal Enfield Interceptor. Royal Enfield's Interceptor of the late 60s was built with high hopes of competing in the American market. It had a 736 cubic centimeter parallel twin, producing about 52 horsepower, and could reach speeds around 110 miles per hour. On paper, it sounded promising, But in practice, it became a mechanical headache that riders quickly grew tired of. While powerful for its time, the engine was plagued by oil leaks, overheating, and frequent mechanical failures. The crankshaft was prone to wear, and the push rod-operated overhead valves often fell out of adjustment. Keeping it running smoothly meant constant maintenance, which most riders weren't prepared for. The four-speed transmission was poorly designed, leading to stiff shifts and false neutrals. The clutch was also weak, slipping under acceleration. The frame, while lightweight, wasn't stiff enough to handle the engine's vibrations, making the bike unstable at high speeds. The Interceptor was unreliable, difficult to maintain, and nowhere near as refined as its competitors in the 60s. Coming up for number 6, 1961 Indian Brave. 1961 Indian Brave. Built in the UK using a 250cc single-cylinder engine, it was meant to be a lightweight commuter bike, but it failed in almost every way. Even in its time, it was considered underwhelming, and by today's standards, it's practically useless. One of the biggest flaws was its power output, just 11 horsepower, which made acceleration painfully slow. Getting up to highway speeds was nearly impossible, and even in city riding, it struggled on inclines. The engine was also unreliable, known for overheating and suffering from piston seizures if ridden for too long. Handling wasn't much better. The suspension was crude, offering a harsh ride over bumps. The brakes were weak, with drum brakes that barely had enough stopping power for emergency situations. The frame itself felt flimsy, leading to a lack of stability in corners. The 1961 Indian Brave was a failure back then, and today, it's completely impractical. The 1968 BSA 65 was meant to bring in gold. Number 5, May 1968. BSA 65. By the late 1960s, BSA was struggling to compete with the wave of advanced motorcycles coming from Japan. The A65 was their attempt at keeping up, featuring a 654 cubic centimeter parallel twin, producing around 38 horsepower. While it had decent speed, the problems outweighed any of its positives, making it a frustrating machine to own. A major issue was the lack of an oil filter in early models. This meant that contaminants built up quickly, leading to accelerated engine wear. Many A65 engines suffered premature failure due to poor lubrication. Another notorious flaw was the vibration. The engine lacked a counterbalancer, which meant that at higher speeds, the bike would shake so violently that bolts would loosen and parts would literally fall off. The Lucas wiring was unreliable, leading to frequent failures of the ignition, lights, and charging system. Many riders found themselves stranded due to a dead battery or a sudden loss of power. Owning an A65 meant dealing with an endless list of mechanical problems. Number 4.4.1963, the Ducati 50 Sport was a small displacement motorcycle aimed at young riders, but it was so underpowered that even in the 1960s, it was barely useful. With a tiny 50cc two-stroke engine producing around 4 horsepower, it struggled to reach 40 miles per hour on flat roads. While it looked sporty, it had no real power, making it frustrating to ride in any situation that required quick acceleration. Even bicycles could sometimes keep up with it in city traffic. The engine components wore out quickly, and the clutch was known for slipping after just a few thousand miles. The carburetor is often clogged, requiring constant cleaning. While Ducati has built many legendary bikes, this isn't one of them. It's a forgotten chapter, best left in the past. Number 3. A reputation killer. The 1965 Norton Navigator. Norton had a reputation for building solid motorcycles, but the 1965 Navigator was an exception. It was meant to be a mid-sized, easy-to-ride bike with a 349 cubic centimeter twin-cylinder engine pushing around 22 horsepower. While it wasn't the fastest thing on 2 wheels, it should have at least been reliable. Unfortunately, it was anything but. The twin-cylinder setup seemed like a good idea, but in practice, it was a disaster. Oil leaks were constant, and mechanical failures were frequent. The pushrod-operated valves often lost adjustment, leading to power loss and rough running. The frame flexed too much under stress, making high-speed riding unstable. The suspension was outdated, offering little comfort over rough roads. On top of that, the 4-speed gearbox was clunky and prone to false neutrals, making shifting an unpredictable experience. In short, the Navigator was far from being a practical choice. Coming as a near second, 1969 BSA Bantam B175. 1969 BSA Bantam B175. The Bantam series was one of BSA's longest-running models, but by the time the 1969 B175 arrived, it was clear the design had run its course. Originally based on a German DKW two-stroke engine design from the 1930s, the Bantam was outdated even when it was new. The B175 was the largest version, but bigger didn't mean better. The 175 cubic centimeter two-stroke engine produced a measly 12 horsepower. Acceleration was slow, and top speed barely touched 60 miles per hour under ideal conditions. The engine also suffered from constant fouling of the spark plug, meaning riders had to clean or replace it frequently just to keep the bike running. Build quality was poor, with cheap materials used in the frame, wiring, and controls. Rust formed quickly on the bodywork, even with minimal exposure to rain. The brakes were weak, and the narrow tires made handling unpredictable on wet or loose surfaces. The B175 represents a time when British manufacturers were falling behind, and it hasn't aged well. Number 1 had so many aspirations. If wishes were indeed horses. The 1964 Aerial Aero. The Aerial Aero was supposed to be the future of lightweight motorcycles, but instead, it became a cautionary tale. It featured a 247 cubic centimeter two-stroke twin-cylinder engine producing around 20 horsepower, paired with a fully enclosed frame design that looked more like a scooter than a traditional motorcycle. The pressed steel frame was weak and flexible, which made the bike feel unstable at higher speeds. Riders reported excessive wobbling in corners and unpredictable steering. The leading link front suspension did little to improve the ride, and the narrow tires struggled for grip. The engine, while decent in power, was unreliable. Piston seizures were common, often caused by poor lubrication or overheating. The exhaust system had a tendency to clog with carbon deposits, reducing power over time. To make matters worse, the bike's unique design made repairs complicated. The Aerial Aero is remembered more for its unusual design than its performance. Know someone who loves vintage motorcycles? Share this video with them. We've covered the worst. Now let's talk about the best. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into motorcycle history.